Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The early morning mist hung low over the sprawling landfill in Quezon City, where mountains of garbage stretched toward the horizon like a dystopian landscape. Among the countless scavengers picking through the refuse, one figure moved with a particular urgency that spoke of desperation rather than routine. Manny wiped the sweat from his weathered brow, his calloused hands sorting through plastic bottles and scraps of metal, with the precision of someone whose survival depended on each valuable piece he could salvage. At 62 years old, Manny had spent the better part of 3 decades in this place that others considered the bottom of society. His back was permanently curved from years of bending over trash heaps, and his lungs carried the permanent rasp of someone who had breathed too much toxic air. The other scavengers knew him as a quiet man who never complained, never caused trouble, and somehow always managed to find enough recyclables to feed his family of 5. What they didn't know was that Manny's world had been quietly transformed by an encounter that happened almost 2 years ago, an encounter so subtle that even he hadn't fully understood its significance until much later. The transformation had begun on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Manny noticed a black SUV parked at the edge of the dump site. Such vehicles occasionally brought government officials or journalists wanting to document the harsh realities of urban poverty, but they rarely stayed long. The smell and the sight of human desperation usually drove them away within minutes. This SUV was different. It stayed for hours, and occasionally, Manny caught glimpses of someone inside observing the daily rhythm of the scavengers' lives. The figure remained in the shadows, never stepping out, never making their presence known to the workers, who continued their backbreaking labor under the scorching Manila sun. That afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Manny discovered a small envelope tucked beneath a pile of sorted bottles near his usual working area. Inside was enough money to buy groceries for 2 weeks, along with a simple note written in careful Tagalog that read, "For your hard work and dignity." There was no signature, no identification, nothing that could trace the gift back to its source. Similar envelopes appeared sporadically over the following months, always in places where only Manny would find them. Sometimes they contained money, other times vouchers for the local medical clinic or grocery store certificates that could feed his entire family. Each envelope came with the same mysterious consistency. They appeared after the black SUV had been spotted near the dump site. Manny never spoke about these discoveries to his fellow scavengers. Something about the careful anonymity of the gifts suggested they were meant to remain private. Instead, he used the unexpected help to gradually improve his family's living conditions. His children, who had been malnourished, began to gain weight. His wife Isadora could finally afford the medicine she needed for her persistent cough. The most remarkable aspect of this silent assistance was how it never made Manny feel diminished or pitied. The gifts came without conditions, without requirements for gratitude or acknowledgement. They simply appeared, like answered prayers from an unknown benefactor who understood that dignity mattered as much as survival. Months passed before Manny finally understood who had been watching over his family. The realization came not through any direct revelation, but through a gradual piecing together of clues: the timing of the SUV visits, the particular attention to anonymity, and, most tellingly, the respectful way the assistance was provided. When the truth finally dawned on him, Manny felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope that extended beyond mere survival. The realization struck Manny like a physical blow while he watched the evening news in the cramped sari-sari store owned by his neighbor Teresa. On the small television screen, Manny Pacquiao was being interviewed about his latest charitable foundation initiative, and something about the boxer's mannerisms triggered a flood of recognition. The way Manny looked down when discussing his charitable work, the humble deflection of praise, the insistence that helping others should remain private, it all aligned perfectly with the anonymous gifts that had been transforming Manny's life. The black SUV that had become a familiar sight near the dump belonged to the most famous Filipino in the world. Yet Manny had chosen to remain invisible, observing from a distance rather than creating the media spectacle that his presence would inevitably generate. This wasn't about publicity or political positioning. This was pure compassion, delivered with the kind of discretion that only someone who truly understood poverty could provide. That night, Bayani lay awake on his thin mattress, listening to the sounds of his family sleeping peacefully around him. His youngest daughter, Remedios, no longer cried from hunger pangs. His son, Renato, had been able to return to school because they could finally afford the uniform and supplies. His wife, Isidora's persistent cough had improved dramatically since she could afford proper medication. All of these improvements had been made possible by someone who had never asked for recognition, never demanded gratitude, never even revealed his identity. Meanwhile, across the city in his comfortable home in Forbes Park, Manny Pacquiao was experiencing his own moments of reflection. The decision to help families like Bayani's had not been born from a single moment of inspiration, but rather from a gradual understanding of his responsibility to those who shared his humble origins. Every visit to the dump site reinforced his memories of childhood hunger, of watching his mother, Dionysia, struggle to provide basic necessities, of understanding that survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. What moved Manny most about these clandestine missions was not the gratitude he would never receive, but the dignity he could help preserve. By remaining anonymous, he ensured that families like Bayani's could accept help without feeling diminished by charity. There was no cameras, no press releases, no tax benefits, just one human being quietly lifting up another during their darkest hours. The logistics of these operations required careful planning. Manny would drive himself in the unmarked SUV, often wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses to remain unrecognizable. He studied the patterns of the scavengers, learning their routines and identifying those who seemed most in need. Bayani had caught his attention, not because he was the poorest among the workers, but because of the quiet determination with which he approached his work, treating even the most degrading labor with a dignity that reminded Manny of his own father's work ethic. Each envelope was prepared with meticulous care. The amounts were calculated to make a meaningful difference without being so large as to attract unwanted attention or suspicion. The notes were written in Manny's own hand, using simple words that conveyed respect rather than pity. Everything was designed to honor the recipient's humanity while providing tangible relief from the crushing weight of poverty. For Bayani, knowing the identity of his benefactor added layers of meaning to each gift. This wasn't random charity from a distant corporation or government program. This was help from someone who had walked similar paths, who understood the specific challenges of growing up with nothing, who had transformed his own escape from poverty into a bridge for others. The knowledge created a profound sense of connection that transcended the transactional nature of typical charitable relationships. Bayani felt seen, understood, and valued by someone whose own journey from poverty to prominence served as proof that circumstances could change, that hope was not naive optimism, but a reasonable response to the possibility of transformation. As months passed, Manny's visits to the landfill became a sacred routine that anchored his increasingly hectic schedule. Between training sessions, business meetings, and public appearances, he carved out precious hours to return to this place that served as his moral compass. The dump site had become more than a location for charitable work. It represented a connection to his authentic self, stripped of the glamour and adulation that surrounded his public life. During these visits, Manny began to notice other workers whose circumstances echoed Bayani's struggles. There was Jericho, a young father of 3 who worked double shifts to afford his children's school fees, and Mayumi, an elderly woman whose arthritic hands made the physical demands of sorting recyclables increasingly painful. Each story of quiet perseverance reminded Manny of the countless untold struggles hidden within Manila's sprawling urban poverty. The expansion of his informal assistance program required even greater discretion. Manny developed an intricate system of observation and delivery that ensured his help reached those who needed it most without creating dependencies or disrupting the delicate social dynamics among the workers. He learned the schedules, habits, and unspoken hierarchies that governed life in the dump, understanding that any intervention had to respect these existing structures. Bayani, meanwhile, was experiencing changes that extended far beyond his family's improved circumstances. The knowledge that someone of Manny's stature had chosen to help him anonymously had awakened a sense of possibility that poverty had long suppressed. For the first time in decades, he began to envision a future that existed beyond the boundaries of the landfill. The most significant change was not financial but psychological. The mysterious assistants had restored Bayani's faith in human goodness, proving that kindness could exist without ulterior motives, that help could be offered without strings attached or expectations of gratitude. This restoration of trust had ripple effects throughout his daily interactions, making him more open to connections with his fellow workers and more willing to share his own small resources when others faced emergencies. Manny's approach to each new recipient required careful study and planning. He observed Jericho's work patterns for weeks before leaving the first envelope, noting the young man's dedication to arriving early and staying late despite receiving the same pay as less committed workers. For Mayumi, the assistance came in the form of medical vouchers, strategically placed where she could find them, without losing face among workers half her age. The boxer's understanding of poverty was not theoretical, but visceral, rooted in memories of his own family's struggles in General Santos City. He remembered the weight of responsibility his mother Dionysia had carried, working multiple jobs while maintaining her dignity in a community that often looked down on single mothers. These personal experiences informed every decision about how to help without inadvertently causing harm or embarrassment. What surprised Manny most about these covert operations was how much they nourished his own spirit. Each successful delivery of assistance provided a satisfaction that exceeded any championship victory or professional achievement. The work reminded him that true strength was not measured in knockout punches, but in the ability to lift others without expecting recognition. Bayani's family began to flourish in ways that extended beyond basic survival. His daughter Remedios showed academic promise that had previously been suppressed by malnutrition and stress. His son Renato developed leadership qualities among his peers, demonstrating the confidence that comes from security rather than desperation. Isadora started a small business selling vegetables, using capital that she believed came from Bayani's improved efficiency at work. The transformation was subtle but profound. The family's improved circumstances attracted no attention from neighbors or social workers, creating the impression that their progress resulted from hard work and good fortune rather than external intervention. This preservation of dignity was perhaps the most valuable gift Manny had provided, allowing the family to rebuild their lives without carrying the psychological burden of charity recipients. The monsoon season brought new challenges to the landfill, transforming the already difficult working conditions into something almost unbearable. The torrential rains turned paths into muddy rivers, made sorting through wet garbage nearly impossible, and created pools of contaminated water that posed health risks to everyone working in the area. Yet the scavengers continued their daily routine because survival left no room for weather-related delays. Manny watched from his SUV as the workers struggled through another rain-soaked morning, their movements slower and more labored as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The sight triggered powerful memories of his own childhood in General Santos City, where similar rains had flooded their small home and forced his family to huddle together on whatever dry ground they could find. The helplessness he had felt as a child, watching his mother Dionysia try to salvage their few possessions from rising water, came flooding back with startling clarity. This personal connection to their suffering made the anonymous assistants feel inadequate. No amount of money could change the fundamental injustice of people being forced to work in such conditions just to survive. The envelopes he left for Bayani, Jericho, Mayumi, and others provided temporary relief but did nothing to address the systemic problems that trapped entire families in cycles of poverty. Bayani noticed the black SUV more frequently during the rainy season, its presence becoming as regular as the morning mist that rose from the warm garbage heaps. Sometimes the vehicle would remain for hours, its occupant apparently content to simply observe the rhythms of their work. The consistency of these visits had become oddly comforting, like having a guardian angel who maintained a respectful distance while offering protection. The mystery deepened when Bayani discovered that the assistance had expanded beyond the occasional envelope. Medical supplies appeared in the first aid station that served the dump workers. The small shelter where they took breaks during the worst weather was quietly repaired and improved. School supplies materialized in the community center where some workers sent their children for basic education. Each improvement was implemented so subtly that it seemed to happen naturally, without fanfare or acknowledgement. Clarita, one of the senior workers who had been sorting recyclables for over 15 years, began to notice patterns that suggested coordination beyond coincidence. The improvements always addressed their most pressing needs, often appearing just when circumstances seemed most desperate. When her grandson Benedicto needed emergency medical care, vouchers for the hospital appeared in her usual working area. When the community's children needed textbooks for the new school year, educational materials showed up at the learning center. Manny's approach to this expanded assistance required even more careful planning and observation. He studied the community's needs through multiple visits, taking mental notes about infrastructure problems, health concerns, and educational gaps. The solutions had to appear organic rather than imposed, respecting the workers' autonomy while providing meaningful support. The psychological impact of this sustained anonymous assistance was becoming evident in subtle changes throughout the community. Workers who had previously competed fiercely for the best scraps began sharing information about productive areas. Families started collaborating on childcare arrangements, allowing more parents to work longer hours. Small acts of mutual support became more common as the general stress level decreased and hope began to replace desperation. For Bayani, the knowledge that Manny Pacquiao was behind these improvements added profound meaning to his daily struggles. Every morning as he prepared for work, he carried with him the awareness that someone who had achieved global recognition still remembered and honored the dignity of people like him. This connection to greatness did not make him feel small. Instead, it expanded his sense of what was possible. The boxer's commitment to anonymity required constant vigilance and creativity. Each delivery had to be timed perfectly. Each improvement had to be implemented without revealing its source. The work was becoming more complex as the assistance expanded, but Manny found deep satisfaction in the challenge of helping without being detected. 3 years into his covert assistance program, Manny faced an unexpected challenge that threatened to expose his carefully maintained anonymity. A local news crew had arrived at the landfill to document the improved conditions, drawn by reports of mysterious infrastructure improvements and the unusual cooperation among workers who had previously been known for fierce competition over resources. The reporter, a persistent young woman named Josefina, seemed determined to uncover the source of the community's transformation. She interviewed several workers, including Clarita, who had become increasingly vocal about the pattern of timely assistance that had been improving their lives. The questions were probing, designed to elicit information about potential benefactors or organizations responsible for the changes. Manny watched the news crew from a greater distance than usual, his SUV parked behind a small hill of compacted refuse that provided cover while allowing him to observe the proceedings. The irony was not lost on him that his desire to help anonymously might be undermined by the very success of his efforts. The community's improvements had become visible enough to attract attention from the outside world. Bayani found himself in an impossible position during his interview. The reporter's questions about the source of recent improvements forced him to choose between protecting his benefactor's privacy and satisfying the journalist's curiosity. His knowledge of Manny's identity created a burden of secrecy that weighed heavily on his conscience, especially when directly questioned about the mysterious assistance his family had received. The tension of the moment was amplified by Bayani's genuine desire to express gratitude publicly. For 3 years, he had carried the weight of unexpressed appreciation, unable to acknowledge the life-changing help he had received. The opportunity to finally speak about the transformation felt both liberating and terrifying. Knowing that revelation might end the assistance that had become crucial to many families, Manny watched as Bayani struggled with the reporter's questions, recognizing the moral conflict playing out across the man's weathered face. The boxer felt a surge of protectiveness toward the community he had been quietly supporting, understanding that media attention could fundamentally alter the dynamic that had made his assistance possible. The news crew's presence also highlighted the broader impact of Manny's 3-year commitment. The landfill community had indeed transformed in measurable ways. Child mortality rates had decreased due to improved access to medical care. Educational attendance had increased as families could afford school supplies and uniforms. The infrastructure improvements had reduced workplace injuries and created more sanitary working conditions. These tangible improvements represented thousands of small interventions, each carefully planned and executed to maintain the illusion of natural progress rather than external charity. The cumulative effect had been to create a community that functioned more like a cooperative than a desperate scramble for survival among competing individuals. Josefina's investigation led her to interview Marilu, the teacher at the small learning center that served the workers' children. The improvements to the facility had been so gradual and well integrated that even Marilu struggled to identify specific moments when changes had occurred. New books had appeared, repairs had been completed, supplies had been restocked, but always in ways that seemed to emerge from within the community rather than being imposed from outside. As the interview progressed, Manny realized that the community itself had become protective of the mystery surrounding their benefactor. Workers deflected questions, provided vague answers, and seemed genuinely uncertain about the source of their improved circumstances. The anonymity had been so complete that even those who had directly benefited could not point to specific evidence of external intervention. The reporter's frustration became evident as she encountered a consistent pattern of grateful acknowledgement coupled with genuine ignorance about the source of assistance. The community had been transformed, but the mechanism of transformation remained hidden even from those who had experienced it firsthand. Watching this unfold, Manny felt a profound sense of accomplishment that exceeded any boxing victory he had achieved. The community had not only accepted his help, but had unconsciously collaborated in protecting the anonymity that made continued assistance possible. The news crew departed the following afternoon without the story they had come to find. Josefina's investigation had yielded compelling footage of community transformation, but no concrete evidence of external intervention. The workers' collective inability to identify their benefactor had created a narrative vacuum that left the reporter with inspirational human interest content, but no investigative revelation to anchor a feature story. As the media van disappeared down the dusty road leading away from the landfill, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the community. Workers who had spent hours being interviewed returned to their routines with a sense of relief that transcended their usual end-of-workday fatigue. The protective instinct that had emerged during the questioning surprised everyone, including those who had participated in it. Bayani felt the weight of his maintained silence most acutely. The decision to protect Manny's anonymity had been instinctive rather than calculated, driven by a deep understanding that exposure would fundamentally alter the relationship between benefactor and community. The choice to remain quiet had felt like a sacred trust, even though it had never been explicitly requested. From his concealed position, Manny had witnessed the entire community choose discretion over recognition, privacy over publicity. The workers had intuitively understood that their mysterious benefactor's anonymity was precious, worth protecting, even when they could not fully explain why. This collective wisdom moved him more profoundly than any championship victory or public accolade ever had. The near exposure prompted Manny to reflect deeply on the sustainability and purpose of his covert assistance program. 3 years of anonymous help had created measurable improvements in the community, but it had also established dependencies and expectations that complicated any potential exit strategy. The workers had not been informed that they were part of an experiment in anonymous charity, yet they had become integral participants in its success. Carmelita, an elderly woman who supervised the children's activities at the learning center, had noticed something during the media interviews that troubled her. Several workers had seemed genuinely distressed by questions about their benefactor, suggesting emotional attachments that extended beyond simple gratitude for material assistance. The mysterious help had become woven into the community's sense of identity and hope for the future. This realization forced Manny to confront the ethical complexity of his approach. By remaining anonymous, he had avoided the psychological burden that typically accompanied charity relationships, but he had also created a situation where the community had developed feelings of connection towards someone they could never acknowledge or thank directly. The one-sided intimacy was both beautiful and potentially problematic. The days following the media visit revealed subtle changes in the community's dynamics. Workers seemed more protective of each other, more careful about discussing their improved circumstances with outsiders. The shared experience of safeguarding their benefactor's secret had created a new level of solidarity that strengthened existing bonds while creating new ones. Bayani found himself emerging as an informal leader within this newly cohesive group. His ability to maintain composure during the interviews, combined with his long tenure at the site and obvious integrity, had earned him respect that transcended the usual hierarchies based on age or productivity. Other workers began seeking his advice on personal matters, creating opportunities for him to pass along some of the wisdom and perspective he had gained through his transformation. The experience also deepened Manny's appreciation for the community's character. Their instinctive protection of his privacy demonstrated a level of sophistication and emotional intelligence that challenged stereotypes about poverty and education. These workers understood concepts of discretion, loyalty, and reciprocity as clearly as any educated elite, applying these principles with remarkable consistency even under pressure. As routine gradually returned to the landfill, Manny realized that the media incident had fundamentally changed his relationship with the community, even though they remained unaware of his direct involvement. The workers had proven themselves worthy of the trust he had placed in them, demonstrating that his faith in their dignity and integrity had been well-founded. The protective silence that had emerged during the interviews became a defining characteristic of the community, creating an invisible bond that united everyone who had participated in safeguarding their mysterious benefactor's anonymity. 4 years after the first mysterious envelope appeared beside Bayani's sorted recyclables, the transformation of the landfill community had evolved beyond individual assistance into something approaching self-sufficiency. The improvements that Manny had carefully orchestrated over time had created a foundation for organic growth that surprised even him with its sustainability and reach. Bayani's son, Renato, had become the first person in the family's history to complete secondary education, achieving grades that earned him a scholarship to a technical college in Manila. The young man's success story rippled through the community, inspiring other families to prioritize their children's education in ways that had previously seemed impossible. What had begun as anonymous assistance to one family had multiplied into a generational shift toward opportunity and hope. The scholarship that enabled Renato's advancement bore no connection to Manny's name or foundation, having been arranged through a complex network of intermediaries that maintained the boxer's commitment to anonymity. Yet Bayani understood intuitively that his son's achievement was connected to the mysterious benefactor who had transformed their family's circumstances years earlier. Manny's visits to the landfill had become less frequent as the community's need for direct intervention diminished. The infrastructure improvements he had funded had created more efficient working conditions that increased productivity and income for everyone. The medical clinic he had quietly supported was now partially funded by the workers themselves, who had organized a cooperative insurance system that pooled resources for healthcare emergencies. The most remarkable development was the emergence of micro-enterprises within the community. Imelda had started a small food stall that served breakfast to workers who previously labored on empty stomachs. Adela organized a childcare cooperative that allowed more parents to work longer hours while ensuring their children received supervision and basic education. These ventures had grown organically from the improved economic stability that Manny's assistance had made possible. Lourdes, a middle-aged woman who had worked in the landfill for over a decade, had surprised everyone by demonstrating exceptional organizational skills once her family's basic needs were met. She had coordinated the formation of a workers' association that negotiated better terms with recycling companies and established fair pricing for different categories of materials. The collective bargaining power had increased everyone's earnings while reducing the destructive competition that had previously characterized the site. These developments represented exactly the kind of sustainable progress that Manny had hoped to catalyze through his anonymous interventions. The community was solving its own problems, creating its own opportunities, and building systems that would outlast any individual benefactor's involvement. The transformation had become self-perpetuating in ways that no amount of direct charity could have achieved. Bayani's role within this evolving community had expanded far beyond his original function as a scavenger. His natural leadership abilities, enhanced by the confidence that came from financial stability, had made him a mediator for disputes, an advocate for new workers, and a bridge between the landfill community and the formal economy beyond its boundaries. The respect he commanded stemmed not from any revealed connection to their mysterious benefactor, but from his consistent demonstration of integrity and wisdom. The psychological transformation of the community was perhaps more significant than the material improvements. Workers who had previously approached each day with resignation now demonstrated entrepreneurial thinking and collaborative problem-solving. The shift from survival mode to growth mode had unleashed human potential that poverty had kept suppressed for generations. Manny observed these changes with a mixture of pride and humility that reflected his understanding of his role in the transformation. He had provided the initial catalyst and support structure, but the community itself had supplied the innovation, determination, and leadership necessary for sustainable progress. His anonymous assistance had created space for their natural capabilities to emerge and flourish. The landfill community had become a quiet success story that demonstrated the power of dignified assistance delivered with respect for recipients, autonomy, and intelligence. The changes were profound enough to attract continued academic and governmental interest, yet subtle enough to maintain the privacy that protected both benefactor and beneficiaries from unwanted attention. As Bayani prepared for another day of work, he carried with him the knowledge that his life's trajectory had been fundamentally altered by someone who had chosen to remain forever unknown, forever unthankable. 5 years had passed since the first mysterious envelope had appeared in Bayani's working area, and the transformation that followed had become the stuff of local legend. The landfill community now functioned as a model of cooperative organization that attracted visitors from development agencies and social work programs across the Philippines. Yet the source of the transformation remained as mysterious as ever, protected by a conspiracy of grateful silence. Bayani stood at the entrance of the technical college, where his son Renato was graduating with honors in electrical engineering. The ceremony represented more than one young man's achievement. It symbolized the breaking of generational cycles that had trapped families in poverty for decades. As he watched his son receive his diploma, Bayani reflected on the invisible hand that had made this moment possible. The landfill itself had evolved into something unrecognizable from the desperate survival ground it had been 5 years earlier. Estrella now managed a successful recycling cooperative that employed over 50 people and had contracts with major Manila businesses. Aurora had opened a training center that taught valuable skills to new workers, reducing the learning curve that had previously made the work even more difficult and dangerous. These enterprises operated with a level of sophistication that challenged assumptions about what communities could achieve when given the right foundation. The workers had developed quality control systems, maintained professional relationships with clients, and created internal advancement opportunities that provided incentives for excellence and leadership development. Manny's final visit to the site occurred on a quiet Sunday morning, when the usual bustle of weekday work had given way to peaceful family activities. Children played in areas that had been cleared and made safe through community effort. Families gathered around small cooking areas, sharing meals and conversation in an atmosphere of security that would have been impossible during the desperate early years. From his SUV, positioned at the familiar observation point that had become sacred to him over the years, Manny watched Bayani teaching a group of new workers the most efficient methods for sorting and categorizing recyclables. The older man's patient instruction and obvious expertise demonstrated how far he had traveled from the desperate scavenger who had first caught Manny's attention. The boxer's decision to gradually reduce his involvement had been vindicated by the community's continued growth and self-improvement. The anonymous assistance had created a foundation for sustainable development that no longer required external support to maintain momentum. The workers had internalized the lessons of cooperation, quality, and mutual support that had been modeled through the mysterious interventions. Letitia, who now served as the community's liaison with government agencies and NGOs, had successfully secured official recognition for their cooperative status and access to microfinance programs that supported continued expansion. The transition from charity recipients to business partners had been completed without anyone outside the community understanding how the transformation had begun. As Bayani concluded his training session with the new workers, he looked toward the hill where the black SUV was parked. As he had done countless times over the years, the distance was too great for him to see the occupant clearly, but something in his posture suggested awareness, recognition, and profound gratitude that transcended the need for direct acknowledgement. Manny felt the weight of unspoken communication in that moment, understanding that Bayani's glance carried 5 years of accumulated appreciation for assistance that had transformed not just one family, but an entire community. The silence between them was sacred, protecting something precious that words would have diminished. Starting his engine for the final time, Manny carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that dozens of families would never again face the desperation that had defined their previous existence. The anonymous assistance had multiplied into permanent change that would benefit generations yet to come. As he drove away from the landfill forever, Manny understood that Bayani had been right in his unspoken assessment. Without the mysterious intervention that had begun 5 years earlier, many of these families would probably still be trapped in circumstances that offered no hope for advancement or dignity. The legacy of silence would protect them all. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.